So my question really to Richard is, can Trump end the war in Ukraine?
Well, let me start by making two general comments about Donald Trump. First, he's unpredictable. We all know this. He seems proud of it. So I don't know what he's going to do, probably any more than he does. Second, any promise made before last year's election cannot be regarded as binding now he's in power. Before the election, he promised to control inflation, reduce grocery prices, lower national debt, eliminate visas for skilled workers, end overseas wars. All now seemingly forgotten in a blizzard of presidential orders that may promote the exact opposite of what was promised. Now, ending the war in Ukraine in 24 hours needs to be seen in that light. Yes, there's no doubt the administration is serious about ending the war. The 24 hours comment was always just rhetorical flourish. But we shouldn't be surprised if the war remains intractable despite American effort. We shouldn't be surprised if Trump just walks away. So what I'm going to do is explore first what the Trump administration, or at least what we think the Trump administration wants out of this. Second, the war aims of both Russia and Ukraine and how well they're doing in achieving them. Third, what pressure the US might be able to bear upon each of the parties to encourage them to compromise, and how each Russia and Ukraine might respond to that encouragement. And fourth, what a peace deal, if it happens, might look like and what each side's looking for. And finally, I'll conclude with some remarks which hopefully will fall well short of making predictions. As I often say at the beginning of my talks, war and warfare are so unpredictable that anyone who claims they know how they're going to end should not be trusted. So let's start with the Americans. As my former colleague, Luke Coffey, now senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, points out, Trump may have appointed unconventional and unorthodox figures to many government positions. But the key foreign policy and national security roles have gone to more traditional appointees, including his special envoy to Ukraine and Russia. This indicates they recognize two things. First, bringing peace to Ukraine is not going to be easy. And second, they're taking this seriously. So what does the Trump administration want to get out of it? This is actually quite a difficult question to answer. Trump himself talks about the human cost of the war, but at the same time threatens war against others. And if he was so concerned about human costs, the apparent imminent closure of USAID may actually cost many more lives than any particular war. Some commentators highlight his focus on achieving the deal and point to his agreement with the Taliban in his first presidency, where achieving a clean deal seemed more important than an equitable outcome. But back then, he was able to blame the subsequent disaster in Afghanistan on his successor, Biden, who had to pick up the pieces. This time it'll be different. He'll have to live with the consequences in Ukraine and for Europe. So although achieving a clean deal may still influence the administration, it's less likely, I think, to drive the outcome than it was in Afghanistan. One of the common foreign policy features amongst his appointed team is hawkishness against China, usually coupled with a belief that Europe should stand up for itself, to allow the USA to focus on what some regard as an existential Chinese threat. They espouse a doctrine of peace through strength, an expression originally attributed to Ronald Reagan and repeated by Donald Trump at his inauguration ball. Demonstrate strength, deter China. If this truly is at the heart of the administration's foreign policy, then it may become clear that what the USA really seeks out of its peacemaking efforts might be credibility. If the USA can demonstrate it has the power to end the war in Ukraine, which means coercing both sides to compromise, then that sends a powerful message to the world, including China. So where does the administration stand in relation to the two sides? Before the election and since, a number of high-profile MAGA personalities and politicians demonstrate clear and consistent anti-Ukraine bias. Some such as Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, journalist Tucker Carlson, consistently parrot Kremlin propaganda and promote an anti-Ukraine agenda. So many have been taken by surprise by the administration's seemingly hardline position on Moscow. Trump himself, on social media, threatened Putin with further economic sanctions and tariffs if he didn't, and I quote, "stop this ridiculous war." He went on to say to Putin, "We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better." The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, during his confirmation hearings, clearly laid out the administration's position, and I quote, "Putin's goal now is to maximize leverage to basically impose neutrality on Ukraine, retrofit, and come back and do this again in 4 or 5 years. That's not an outcome I think any of us would favor." Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth observed that we know who the aggressor is, we know who the good guy is. We would like to see it advantageous for the Ukrainians as possible. And Trump's envoy, General Keith Kellogg, has also stated that Trump is not trying to give anything to Putin or the Russians. He's trying to save Ukraine and preserve its sovereignty and will ensure that it's fair and just. Of course, Trump may change his mind. As we'll see shortly, that's what Putin seems to be banking on. But right now, Washington, D.C. appears resolute. To quote again the Hudson Institute's Luke Coffey, "So far, so good." So to close this section, the US administration genuinely seeks an end to this war in a way it never did under Biden. And it seems to understand that both the main cause of the war and the greatest obstacle to peace lie in the Kremlin. Okay, so we've looked at what the USA seeks to get out of this. Let's examine what both Ukraine and Russia want. On the face of it, both sides have made no secret about what their strategic objectives are. The Ukrainians have stated they seek restoration of all their territory, including to Crimea, security guarantees to prevent a rearmed and rested Russia from invading again, financial restitution for damage done by Russian forces against Ukraine, and justice for war crimes committed against Ukrainians. Putin, to an international audience, talks about claiming the territory of the 4 southeastern oblasts that Russia has, in its mind, absorbed into the Russian Federation. Plus, of course, Crimea seized in 2014. It seeks what it calls the denazification of Ukraine, which is generally understood to mean appointing a Putin-approved government in Kyiv, what we would describe as regime change. It also seeks Ukrainian demilitarization so that, in the Kremlin's words, Ukraine can no longer threaten Russia. And lastly, it stated that Ukraine must never join NATO and that no NATO forces can be stationed in Ukraine. These two positions, as often, but not always, the case in war, are diametric opposites. On one hand, Ukraine seeks restoration of its sovereignty and guarantees of future security. On the other, Russia seeks to remove that sovereignty and render Ukraine defenseless. But that's just the stated goals. A quick look at Russian media or survey of Putin's comments to a domestic audience indicate that Russia's goals, real goals, might be much, much wider. The political discourse is full of restoring Russia's status as a global power, of rebuilding the Soviet Empire, of turning Berlin, Paris, London into rubble, of being an equal to the United States. Margarita Simonian, the editor-in-chief of state-owned Russia Today, talks openly of the necessity for and inevitability of future wars. That Russia's military is the only tool it has to restore its power and its glory. And that Russia's economic future depends on greater military spending, not less. That Russia's war economy should be permanent. Putin and his spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, emphasized the importance of Putin ignoring Zelensky and negotiating directly with Trump as the leaders of two great powers. The subtext being two great equal powers, and that Ukraine simply a pawn between them. Melbourne-based commentator Michael Lvrivsky has spoken here at AIIA Victoria about how Putin's worldview goes back deep into history, to the myth of the establishment of Kievan Rus and the formation of the Russian Orthodox Church in 988 AD, and that he's motivated by a deep sense of historic destiny. In this misreading of history, Ukraine is Russia and has no separate identity. Now, anyone who managed to stay awake through the whole 3 hours of Tucker Carlson's interview with Vladimir Putin will understand that Putin truly believes this stuff. He's deeply motivated by destiny. Hence the frequent references to Peter the Great, the glories of Russian history, religion, and culture. If this is true, if Russia's real aims are more to do with restoration of status and some mythical historic destiny, then what they're seeking has got little to do with the Donbass or a particular Ukrainian town here or there. Instead, the Kremlin's objective is deeper and wider and relates to Russia's place in the world and in history. It involves rewriting the global order and establishing Russian supremacy in Europe. And they see the principal obstacle to that objective as lying not in Ukraine, but in NATO. It's possible, of course, that this historic destiny narrative, the narrative the Kremlin pushes at home, is simply a device to sustain popular domestic support for the war and that when negotiations begin, the Kremlin will be solely interested in achieving much narrower goals in Ukraine. But I really don't think so. Now, it's worth highlighting here that neither side is anything close to achieving their objectives in this war. Yes, Russia continues to make advances in the Donbass, but slowly and at great cost. In 2024, the Russians seized about 4,000 square kilometers of Donetsk Oblast. At this rate, it'll take another 2 years to capture the rest of this one oblast, let alone the much larger areas of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, which remain under Ukrainian control. Putin hopes, as he has hoped since the beginning of this war, that the West will become bored with supporting Ukraine. He restated last week that Ukraine wouldn't last 2 months without Western support. But the European allies appear to be becoming more determined, not less. And, as we've already seen, there's no real sign that the Trump administration is about to give up either. American arms continue to flow to Ukraine. Now, on the Ukrainian side, the strategy appears to focus on raising the cost to Russia of continuing to wage war, both the human cost and the economic cost. Russian casualties in 2024 were the highest since the war started. As we know, casualty figures are closely guarded secrets on both sides, although Zelensky today actually revealed Ukrainian casualties. But most independent assessments agree that Russian casualties were abnormally high in the latter part of 2024. The Ukrainian General Staff estimate Russian casualties last year at over 420,000. And the Russian economy is really struggling, despite many Kremlin trolls claiming the opposite. Inflation is rampant. Interest rates are at a historic high. It's a dramatic shortage of workers and chronic lack of investment in non-military parts of the economy. Also, Ukraine sustained an effective assault on Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, as well as ever-tightening international sanctions, are having increasing impact on Russia's ability to export, raise foreign capital, and stabilize the ruble. So Russia is struggling. As Alexandra Propenko of the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center in Berlin has pointed out, Putin's current strategy is unsustainable. But, she adds, it's likely to come to a head this year. It's unlikely to come to a head this year. I quote, simmering economic problems are unlikely to overpower the forces that keep Putin bent on continuing the war. The possibility of popular pressure in Russia is low. For many Russians, dignity has come to mean state-provided salaries and pensions rather than political or civil liberties. Public sentiment may change as inflation continues to bite. But the idea that Putin's wartime leadership means economic prosperity and national pride, this idea will be difficult to shake from the public consciousness. Yet, the war is unpopular in Russia. Last week, Leonid Volkov, who's also spoken here, of the Russian opposition movement, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, released polls that show anxiety levels in Russia are rising consistently. And that, when asked to cite priorities for government funding, only 12% put military spending higher than education, pensions, and healthcare. But as another prominent Russian opposition figure, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, pointed out last month, Putin doesn't really care about all that. He's not going to get any poorer. It's not his children who are being killed in Ukraine. He's not personally endangered by the Ukrainian invasion of Kursk. And as long as he can keep enough of the population quiet and can sustain the organs of state oppression, then popular discontent is unlikely to force a change of Russian strategy in 2025. Not impossible, but unlikely. So Ukraine's strategy to cumulatively, continuously raise the human and economic cost to Russia of continuing this war is unlikely to cause the Kremlin to falter, at least this year. And it's unlikely to achieve their strategic objectives in the short to medium term. We're in what the peace theorists classically describe as a mutually hurting stalemate, where neither side can achieve their goals. Mutually hurting stalemate, normally the prerequisite for the kinds of compromises that might end a war. It's possible, of course, that the West will suddenly give up and Putin can win a military victory, especially given Trump's inconsistency. But frankly, it's unlikely, at least in the short term. And it's possible that the Putin regime may suddenly collapse, bringing to power a completely different government that voluntarily withdraws from Ukraine. When dictatorships collapse, they usually do so without warning. We've seen in Syria. But, as we just discussed, in Russia, that's unlikely, at least in the short term. So each side can harbor some glimmer of hope that their strategies might work. It's only a distant glimmer. Zelensky is more realistic than Putin in recognizing this. Putin clings to the belief that strategic success is just round the corner, despite strong evidence to the contrary. This, by the way, is the greatest weakness of dictatorship. In democracies, when a plan is failing, the leader has to change or be removed. Dictators just double down into greater disaster. But despite Putin's misplaced worldview, the key point here is that Trump might well be right. Now may be the best time to make a real attempt to end this war. Let's see how that might happen. The fact that this is happening now, at Trump's insistence, is because both sides understand that the USA has real power to change the course of the war. And this administration appears to have the appetite to use that power in a way that the previous administration seemed too fearful to do. As with most efforts of persuasion, it'll probably involve a balance of sticks and carrots. For the Ukrainians, this means the Americans threatening the withdrawal of military support unless they're prepared to compromise over territory. The main stick. Although the USA provides under half of all international assistance to Europe, there are many weapons and types of weapons that only the USA can provide or authorize others to provide, like F-16 fighters or Patriot air defense missiles. What this stick threatens is Ukraine's defeat and destruction as an independent country. The main Ukrainian carrot is likely to be something related to security guarantees, which we'll explore more fully shortly, and also perhaps an undertaking to help rebuild their war-ravaged country. For the Russians, it's more complex. The sticks are relatively obvious. Unless the Russians compromise, the US administration has threatened to ramp up military support to Ukraine significantly. This might include lifting restrictions on the use of US weapons, provisions of far more long-range capability, deepening intelligence technology support. The Americans would want to ensure that the Kremlin cannot achieve even their short-term objectives in the Donbass. But what it does not do, what this stick does not do, it does not threaten Putin's defeat. The other aspect of the stick is economic. Trump has already threatened increased sanctions and tariffs on Russian goods. But these, frankly, will have little impact on Putin, whose economic lifeline, slender as it is, now lies with China and India, not the USA and the West. More effective might be the measure Trump announced a fortnight ago to persuade Saudi Arabia to reduce the price of oil. Reduce it to such an extent that the Russians will have to sell their oil at a loss, even to their remaining markets. This will exacerbate Russia's shortage of currency, further weaken the ruble, and compound inflation. We wait to see how effective American diplomacy might be in achieving this. There's also the possibility of what I call the big stick, that the Americans, perhaps exasperated with Russian intransigence, might give up trying to achieve an agreement between the two warring parties and instead impose a deal on Russia, rather like they did with the Serbs at Dayton. But to work, this would have to include the threat of direct US military action against Russia. And there's nothing in the current US discourse to suggest this is even a remote possibility. It remains a possibility, however unlikely. Potential carrots that American negotiators might offer the Russians are problematic, because carrots essentially mean relaxing the sanctions regime. Already, Hungary and some right-wing German politicians are calling for the re-import of cheap Russian gas as a benefit of a ceasefire. But others, especially Baltic and Eastern Europeans, argue strongly that Europe must never again be vulnerable to Russian energy blackmail. And it is worth pointing out that the main beneficiary of Europe weaning itself off Russian gas has been the USA, which now provides the lion's share of Europe's liquid natural gas. And I'm sure American negotiators will be fully aware of the benefits to their own economy of maintaining this particular sanction. And if, as Secretary Rubio has pointed out, a key American concern is ensuring that Putin doesn't reinvade Ukraine in the future, then there's clear benefit in maintaining a high level of economic coercion. One carrot that might not undermine that coercion is lifting of personal sanctions. The personal sanctions that are imposed on many hundreds of regime supporters, oligarchs, state propagandists, government ministers, military figures responsible for war crimes. For many, of course, it'd be highly distasteful to see Russian propagandists and their offspring jet skiing beside their yachts moored off the French Riviera, or once again buying up premium London real estate, using wealth gained through state corruption. It's more than just distaste. The Anti-Corruption Foundation, established by the late Alexei Navalny, sees personal sanctions against members of the current regime and their supporters as one of the most important tools in achieving eventual political change in Russia. Lifting personal sanctions will help further cement the legitimacy of Putin's regime and reduce the benefits of anyone challenging that rule. It would clearly be in the USA's long-term interest to see positive political change in Russia. Most people see that. But I rather suspect this does not figure in American calculus right now. I suspect their imperative is to end the war, even if it means strengthening Putin's grip on power at home. So how might each side respond to these carrots and sticks? On the Ukrainian side, Zelensky's already indicated they'll be prepared to discuss a ceasefire along the current front line, as long as it doesn't imply legal transfer of ownership of territory to Russia. The key thing the Ukrainians will seek in exchange for this compromise is a security guarantee. Let's see why. The Australian YouTube analyst Perun makes an obvious but really important point. The Kremlin states, probably accurately, they're able to recruit voluntarily around 30,000 men per month into their army, well in excess of the new recruits that Ukraine can field. But the fact that despite these numbers, over the last year, despite these numbers, the Russians aren't able, increasingly, or at all, to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses, that they're still in a stalemate. This kind of indicates that some estimates of Russian casualties for around 30,000 per month may well be accurate. This is supported by multiple reports that Russians are sending wounded troops back to the front. Last week, an image appeared showing Russian infantry in an assault on crutches. This wouldn't be happening if Russian manpower was plentiful. So as Perun argues, if there is a ceasefire, and if the Russians continue to recruit into the army, remember Margarita Simonyan's statement that Russia should focus the economy more on its armed forces, not less, then the first thing that would happen is the Russian army would expand by around 30,000 men per month, because they're not being killed or wounded in battle. On the Ukrainian side, the emphasis will almost certainly be rebuilding their shattered state. And who would doubt that European nations would also seek the respite of a ceasefire, if not to achieve some kind of peace dividend, at least to rebuild their own depleted defense stocks and armories, rather than continuing to strengthen the Ukrainian army against a steadily increasing Russian threat. And how can Ukraine attract the international investment needed to rebuild its state and economy if it's in severe danger of being reinvaded? This is at the heart of Zelensky's need for security guarantees. The fear that, under American pressure, even if the Russians agree to compromise their territorial ambitions and accept a ceasefire, it'll be just for the short term. The fear that Putin may cut his losses in the short term, but with a clear intention of achieving his maximalist goals, including capturing Kyiv in 2, 3, 4 years' time, whenever they built their strength and they think the West has lost interest in Ukraine. So, for the Ukrainians, they'll take American peace efforts seriously. They have to. Their own survival is at stake. But they'll work hard to achieve a realistic security guarantee. We'll look shortly at what that actually means. The Russians, on the other hand, have a completely different view. We've already seen that the American stick can only, at best, prevent Russian victory, not threaten its defeat, unlike for Ukraine. So it's going to seem easier to the Americans to extract concessions from Ukraine than it is from Russia. Russia will try and exploit this, and it's likely that Russia's current hard line towards negotiation, which it's currently presenting, is geared to setting the stage and tilting the whole process to Russia's favor. Now, many commentators suggest that Moscow doesn't want this war to end. This fits Putin's misplaced idea that he's actually winning. If they do enter into negotiations, these commentators believe, it'll be to place Ukraine at a disadvantage and use the process to convert the USA against Ukraine. Or alternatively, to accept a temporary ceasefire and use the time to rearm, ready for reinvasion in a few years' time. It's impossible to know whether Russian negotiators, when negotiations actually start, and I'm pretty sure they will start, I don't know whether they'll focus on using the process to place the Ukrainians at a disadvantage while preventing a ceasefire, or in agreeing to a ceasefire, but insisting on no effective security guarantee, thereby allowing Russia to achieve its goals when it wants later. What I can guarantee, and this is the only thing in this talk that I can guarantee, which I'm 100% certain, is that the Russians will launch an unprecedented propaganda blitz to persuade the USA that Ukraine is to blame, that it's Zelensky who's blocking progress towards peace, not Putin. They'll mobilize every channel available to them to set the narrative, to flood MAGA channels. I can further guarantee that the usual bunch of Putin apologists in the US will parrot this propaganda line for line. People like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson, probably Elon Musk, possibly Vice President Vance. Of course, American negotiators will know the truth. But the Kremlin will attempt to change the discourse in the States so to directly affect Trump's thinking over and above his negotiators, and persuade him to sanction Ukraine into making greater concessions, and at the same time, limit Ukraine's ability to defend itself against continuing Russian attack. We have to expect this. We just hope the US government can recognize it for what it is and hold firm. It doesn't mean that an equitable ceasefire deal won't be reached, but there'll be a lot of disinformation being blasted out there that'll make it much more difficult. So what might a deal look like if the two sides can be made to agree? And that, of course, is a big if. Broadly, there are four main issues. First, cessation of the fighting. Second, agreement on geography, who gets to keep what, which therefore defines the ceasefire line. Third, what is the legal status of the territory in question? And finally, the mechanism to enforce the agreement. The US position seems to be that the most important aspect is the ceasefire. A ceasefire which might theoretically create negotiating space to address the really difficult issues and the different national objectives. Secretary of State Rubio knows how difficult all this will be. Quote, "This is not going to be an easy endeavor. It will require bold diplomacy. I hope it can begin with some ceasefire." It's going to be difficult because, as we've discussed, Ukraine needs security guarantees before agreeing a ceasefire, before giving Russia the breathing space to rebuild its forces for perhaps another go at Kyiv. The physical terms of the ceasefire, as opposed to the conditions, such as the security guarantees, the physical terms shouldn't be too difficult. Yes, they might be complicated, and yes, every situation is different. But negotiating ceasefires is something the global community has considerable experience of, and if the will is there, shouldn't be too difficult. But where to draw the line, who gets what, will be one of the number of seemingly intractable difficulties facing American negotiators. As we've discussed, Ukraine might be prepared to concede occupation of the territories that Russia's already occupied, but won't want to cede land that it's still occupied, that Ukraine still occupies and has fought so hard to retain. Russia, on the other hand, says the absolute minimum it would accept is ownership of the 4 oblasts that it's formally stated are part of Russia. Luhansk and Donetsk, which make up the Donbass, together with Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, neither of whose capitals, cities, the Russians control. And of course, in addition to Crimea. Reining in Russian demands for land that they've been unable to capture, despite 3 years of war and perhaps 1 million casualties. Reining in demands to win land by treaty that they cannot win by war will be one of the key tests for the American negotiating team. The Ukrainian invasion and occupation of Kursk needs to be seen in this light. Ukraine makes no secret that they don't intend to permanently annex this territory. Instead, it's a strategic bargaining chip to encourage Russia to yield Ukrainian territory, which of course is the main reason why the Russians are absolutely determined to win it back before negotiations occur. Russian commentators suggest that about 60,000 Russian troops are dedicated to the Kursk counteroffensive, plus however many of the 12,000 North Koreans still survive. So where to draw the ceasefire line is one of the major issues of negotiation. The next major issue of any peace deal is the legal status of the contested territories. Russia, of course, wants international recognition that any lands it occupies are legally part of Russia. Ukraine, equally obviously, wants international recognition that all occupied lands, temporarily occupied lands, the term they use, remains legally Ukrainian, and that Russian occupation is illegal under international law. Certainly, most of the West agrees with the Ukrainian position. Fearful of further future Russian expansion, few want to see Russian aggression in Ukraine rewarded with international legitimacy. This also appears to be the position of the US administration. All senior positions, with the exception of Vice President Vance, have publicly stated that Russia cannot be seen to have won this war. My suspicion, however, is that this issue will not be a major obstacle to achieving a ceasefire agreement. Negotiators will probably be able to find a form of words that leaves the legal status of contested territories open to be resolved by further talks sometime in the future. So if the legal status of the occupied lands is unlikely to be a major stumbling block for now, then security guarantees certainly will be. In an essay last week, Professor Sir Lawrence Friedman explored this issue for Ukraine. Clearly, he argues, NATO membership with its Article 5 mutual defense clause remains the gold standard for guaranteeing Ukraine's security. But previous administrations in both the USA and in Germany have been against it, largely in the interests of escalation management, as well, of course, the pro-Kremlin regimes of Fico and Orban, who would seek to veto Ukraine's accession to NATO. Polling suggests that the next German government might be more pro-Ukrainian and could be prepared to change its position on NATO membership. It's more difficult to assess the US administration's position. It's possible, perhaps, that it might be on the cards if it's the only way to end the war. But as one of Trump's aides recently said in relation to potential Ukrainian membership, you cannot ask the American people to expand the umbrella of NATO when the current members aren't paying their fair share. So Ukraine's future security becomes tied up with Trump's well-rehearsed argument that European states aren't paying enough for their own defense. If this is the case, if NATO membership is off the cards, what might a security guarantee look like? What's absolutely clear is that any agreement signed by Russia without credible means to enforce it is meaningless. There's a long list of international agreements since 1991 broken by Moscow, including the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia, the US, and the UK guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for Ukraine giving Russia its nuclear weapons. So the real issue is not signing the treaty, it's the means to enforce it. Most discussion revolves around the idea of international forces stationed in Ukraine. The idea being their presence would deter either side from breaking the ceasefire. but international presence alone does not deter. Before the 2022 invasion, OSCE maintained a military mission to monitor the Donbass ceasefire as part of the Minsk agreement, but that didn't deter Putin from invading, since it wasn't supported by credible threat of force. At Davos recently, Zelensky spoke of a force of 200,000 being needed, actually in Ukraine, to deter Russia. That's probably well beyond Europe's capacity to provide. Rule of thumb is you need 3 times the force actually deployed to cover preparation, training, and sustainment. And it's difficult to imagine the US administration agreeing to long-term deployment of US troops in Ukraine, given its focus on the Pacific. And of course, the makeup of the ceasefire monitoring and deterrent force will have to be agreed by Russia if it's part of any kind of ceasefire or peace agreement. And given that many Russians are convinced that they're already fighting the whole of NATO, Putin is probably as unwilling to accept NATO forces in Ukraine as Zelensky is to accept North Koreans, neither perceived to be impartial. But those nations that might be impartial, the traditional nations who commit to UN peace operations, so-called blue helmets, these won't be seen as a credible deterrent to Russian reinvasion. So unless the US ends up wielding the big stick, unless the US imposes a ceasefire by force, and so assuming the two parties have to agree to a ceasefire, then the size, makeup, and mandate of an international force in Ukraine will be one of, if not the most contentious and intractable issues that General Kellogg, the American chief negotiator, is facing. So what can we make of all this? Can Trump end the war in Ukraine? I'm not going to answer that question. But I will make 4 points by way of conclusion. First, we're not talking peace, about bringing peace to Ukraine. The Kremlin's ambitions are too bold and too deep-seated for any sticks or carrots that the Americans or anyone else can wield. The best we can hope for, while Putin remains in power, is a truce that holds. Second, it's going to be incredibly difficult to achieve even that, a truce. Even if the Russians agree to cease the fighting, it will, in their minds, only be temporary, for as long as Putin's in power. And the Ukrainians will look for security guarantees that the major powers currently find difficult to provide, and Russia will find difficult to accept. Third, the process may be more important than the result. Even if a ceasefire proves impossible, it should clarify in everyone's mind what each side really wants. And if Trump's team are true to their word, that means either ramping up military support to Ukraine to prevent Russian victory, if they think the Kremlin's to blame, or cutting off aid to Ukraine and enable Russian victory, if they think Kyiv's to blame. Either way, it'll have strategic impact. And fourth, finally, the Kremlin propaganda machine will do its utmost to confuse the negotiation and pin the blame of deadlock on Zelensky. They'll attempt to persuade the White House to sanction Ukraine. And if they fail in that, and the US finds this is all just too difficult, they'll try to persuade Donald Trump simply to walk away and leave the Europeans to solve European problems. Unfortunately, the Kremlin now has many friends and agents in the modern Republican Party. Friends and agents who will be all too eager to try to influence the White House in that direction. So, to end, this could be an historic opportunity to either end the war or dramatically alter its course for the better. But it depends upon the steadfastness of the White House to wield its influence decisively and withstand a concerted misinformation campaign. Steadfastness. Which brings me back to the beginning, to the 2 points I made about Donald Trump. He's unpredictable, and he might just walk away. So we'll see. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.